Can you take my dog instead of me? The man sitting on the bench slowly lowered his newspaper. Dog, he said, blinking once in confusion. A dog? You mean that dog? His eyes moved down to the tiny bundle tucked inside the girl's sweater. And why? He added, leaning back slightly. Would I have to take your dog instead of you? The late afternoon sunlight stretched across Riverside Park in long golden bands. Annie Carter stood a few steps in front of the bench. In her arms was a tiny golden puppy wrapped carefully inside her sweater. The puppy's nose poked out, twitching softly as it breathed. My family can't keep him, she said. The man studied her with mild curiosity. Oh, Annie nodded. My mom works a lot, she explained, and our apartment is really small. The building doesn't allow pets, and we don't have enough money for dog food or a doctor if he gets sick. She looked down at the puppy as she spoke. But I couldn't leave him there. Where did you find him? The man asked. By the sidewalk when I was walking home from school, Annie said. He was lying in the grass by himself. She pointed toward the edge of the park. He was making tiny crying sounds, like he was scared. The puppy stirred slightly in her arms, as if remembering. So, you picked him up, the man said. Yes. And brought him home. Yes. And your mother said no. Yes. Annie didn't sound angry about it, just sad. The man nodded slowly. That sounds like a responsible mother. Annie gave a small shrug. She felt bad too, she said. But we just can't take care of him the way he deserves. The puppy shifted again, pushing its tiny head further out of the sweater. Oh, Annie added suddenly, brightening a little. His name is Lulu. The man raised an eyebrow. Lulu? I named him, Annie said proudly. Because when I first picked him up, he made a little Lulu sound. The puppy gave a sleepy yawn, as if agreeing with the story. The man glanced at the dog again. Well, Lulu seems comfortable, he said. Annie nodded. He's really sweet. There was a short pause before she asked the question again. So will you take him? The man sighed softly. I'm afraid not. Annie blinked. Why not? The man folded his newspaper carefully and placed it beside him. I don't like dogs, he said calmly. Annie looked genuinely surprised. You don't? No. Why? The man hesitated briefly. When I was about your age, he said, a neighbor's dog bit me pretty badly. Annie's eyes widened. Really? Really? It hurt? Quite a lot. He rubbed his left forearm unconsciously where the faint scar still existed. So ever since then, he continued, I've stayed away from dogs. Annie looked down at Lulu. Well, Lulu is too little to bite like that. The man almost smiled. That may be true, he said. But I'm still not the right person. He gestured lightly toward the street beyond the park. There are animal shelters in the city. They help dogs find homes. Annie shook her head slowly. I thought about that. And? My friend at school said sometimes the shelters are very full, Annie said quietly. And sometimes dogs get scared there. She held Lulu closer. I don't want Lulu to be scared. The man studied her again. Well, maybe you could give him to someone else, he suggested. A neighbor, perhaps. Annie looked around the park. There were more people earlier, she said. And? They all walked away fast. The man nodded. So you picked me, he said. Annie nodded. You were sitting here by yourself. That's not much of a qualification. Annie tilted her head thoughtfully. You look like a good person. The man didn't respond to that. The puppy shifted again. Its tiny paw slipped out from the sweater sleeve and trembled slightly. The man noticed. Is Lulu cold? He asked. A little. The sun was dropping lower now, and the breeze carried a sharper chill. Annie walked over to the bench. Before the man could react, she gently placed Lulu into his lap. The movement was quick but careful. Lulu blinked up at him. For a moment the man froze. Every instinct from childhood told him to move away. But Lulu didn't bark. The puppy simply leaned forward and gave the man's hand a small lick. Then Lulu circled twice on the man's coat and curled into a warm ball. Within seconds, the puppy was asleep. The man stared down at the tiny dog. Its breathing was slow and peaceful. Annie watched his face. Then she said quietly, You know, you look like someone who doesn't have anyone sitting next to them. The man glanced up. Annie pointed at the empty space beside him on the bench. My grandpa used to say people shouldn't sit alone too much, she added. She gently pushed Lulu a little closer into his lap. It would be really nice, Annie said softly. If you had a friend to walk with. The wind moved through the trees again, scattering leaves across the path. The man sat very still. Instead, he sat on a park bench with a sleeping puppy named Lulu in his lap, while a little girl stood in front of him, waiting to see if he would change his mind. Lulu stirred slightly in Ethan Caldwell's arms. The tiny puppy had not moved much since Annie placed him there. Curled against Ethan's coat, he looked as though he had belonged there his entire life. Ethan looked down at the little animal with a mixture of confusion and reluctant curiosity. "Well," he murmured quietly, "this is not how I planned my afternoon." Across from him, Annie stood patiently with her hands folded behind her back. She didn't rush him. Children sometimes understood something. Adults forgot important decisions needed silence first. Lulu's ear twitched. Ethan hesitated, then slowly reached down and gently brushed his fingers across the puppy's head. The fur was soft, warmer than he expected. Lulu responded instantly, stretching his neck and letting out a tiny, satisfied sigh before pushing his nose deeper into Ethan's coat. Ethan froze. "That," he said quietly, glancing up at Annie, "was purely accidental." Annie smiled. "You're petting him." "I absolutely am not. You just did." Ethan looked back down at the puppy. "Well, maybe once." He carefully rubbed Lulu's head again, slower this time, testing the feeling like someone touching water for the first time. Lulu's tail wagged lazily against Ethan's coat. Ethan muttered. "That means he likes you," Annie said. "So you've mentioned." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan straightened slightly. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "since this appears to have become a formal meeting, introductions might be appropriate." Annie blinked. Ethan gave a small nod. "My name is Ethan Caldwell." Annie repeated it carefully. "Ethan, Mr. Caldwell usually," he added with a faint smile. She nodded again. "My name is Annie." "Annie what?" "Annie Carter." "Well, Annie Carter," Ethan said, "you have put me in a rather unusual situation." Annie looked down at Lulu. "I know." Ethan glanced back toward the path where joggers occasionally passed. "You mentioned earlier your family can't keep him." Annie nodded. "Our apartment building doesn't allow pets," she explained again. "And my mom says dogs need food, and doctor visits, and toys, and lots of time." All accurate statements. She works 2 jobs sometimes. Ethan's expression shifted slightly. "What does your mother do?" "She helps people at the hospital," Annie said. "She says she's not the doctor, but she helps the doctors." "A nurse's aide?" "I think so." "That's hard work." Annie nodded. "That's why I can't ask her to take care of Lulu too." Ethan looked down at the puppy again. Lulu had now rolled slightly onto his back, exposing his tiny belly in complete trust. "Ethan Sahid, you realize," he said slowly, "that taking responsibility for a dog is a serious commitment." Annie nodded. "I know." "And you believe I'm the right candidate for that commitment?" "Yes." "Based on what evidence?" Annie thought for a moment. "You didn't move him away." Ethan looked down again. "Well, he seems comfortable." Lulu shifted again and pressed his tiny paw against Ethan's hand. Without thinking, Ethan gently scratched behind the puppy's ear. Lulu let out a soft, happy grunt. Ethan glanced up quickly, realizing what he had just done. "That was also accidental," he said. Annie giggled. "You're getting better at it." Ethan shook his head. "You are a very persuasive young negotiator, Annie Carter. My teacher says I ask too many questions." "In my experience," Ethan said, "that's usually how smart people start." "My bus stop is near the corner," she said quietly. Ethan looked at her. "You take the bus home alone?" "Sometimes. And today? I walked." "Why?" "I wanted to make sure Lulu found someone." If this moment between Annie and Lulu touched your heart, please take a second to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. Your support helps these stories reach more people. And if you are, believe kindness still matters. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories like this. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. The girl had carried this small animal across half the neighborhood just to make sure it would be safe. "That's a lot of responsibility for someone your age," he said. Annie shrugged. "He was smaller than me." Ethan chuckled softly. "That is a surprisingly logical explanation." They both looked down at Lulu again. The puppy was still sleeping peacefully in Ethan's lap. "Does Lulu always fall asleep this fast?" Ethan asked. He was scared earlier, Annie said. I think he feels safe now. Ethan considered that quietly. Safe. It had been a long time since that word meant anything to him. Annie, Ethan said after a moment. Are you absolutely certain there isn't someone else who could take Lulu? Annie shook her head. I asked 2 people before you, and they said they were busy. Ethan nodded slowly. That sounded about right for most people in a city. Well, he said, glancing down at the puppy again. Lulu appears to have made his own decision. Annie smiled. He picked you. Ethan sighed. But there was a faint hint of amusement in his voice now. That may be the most irresponsible hiring process I've ever witnessed. Annie laughed softly. The sound was bright and honest. For a moment, Ethan simply listened. Then he looked down again at Lulu and gently stroked the puppy's back once more. The little tail wagged. All right, Lulu, Ethan murmured quietly. The puppy twitched in his sleep. I suppose we should discuss your future. Annie watched him carefully. Hope flickered across her face. The evening breeze rolled in from the lake, carrying the cool promise of night. The sun had almost reached the edge of the trees when Annie began walking toward the park gate. Ethan Caldwell remained on the bench. Lulu was still asleep in his lap. For a long moment, Ethan simply watched the small golden puppy breathe. The rhythm was slow and peaceful, completely unaware that his future was being quietly negotiated in the middle of Riverside Park. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Well, he muttered softly. This is a strange situation. Lulu's tail twitched. Ethan looked down again. The puppy had rolled slightly onto his side, one tiny paw resting against Ethan's wrist. Without really thinking about it, Ethan gently ran his fingers along Lulu's back again. The puppy let out a small, contented sound. Ethan stopped immediately. You're very manipulative for someone who weighs 3 pounds, he said quietly. Behind him, the park path crunched lightly. Ethan turned. Annie had stopped walking. She stood halfway down the path, looking back toward him. You're still petting him, she said. Ethan cleared his throat. I'm evaluating him. For what? For behavioral stability. Annie walked back a few steps toward the bench. And? Ethan glanced down again. Preliminary results suggest he is extremely lazy. Annie smiled. He had a big day. That's true. Ethan sat forward slightly. You know something, Annie Carter? What? You are very confident leaving a dog with a complete stranger. Annie shrugged. You told me your name. That does not qualify as a background check. But you told the truth. Ethan tilted his head. How do you know that? My mom says people who lie don't usually say their names first. Ethan let out a quiet laugh. Your mother sounds like a very practical person. She is. Lulu shifted again and pressed his nose deeper into Ethan's coat. Ethan glanced toward the park entrance. Do you live nearby? He asked. Annie pointed toward a row of apartment buildings beyond the street. Over there. That's a decent walk. I walk it every day. Ethan nodded. You're a brave kid. I had Lulu with me today. That helps. The wind drifted through the trees again. The sky above the lake had begun turning a deep amber. Annie stepped closer to the bench again. Do you travel a lot? She asked. Ethan looked up. Yes. For work? Yes. What do you do? Ethan thought for a moment. I move things. Like trucks? Yes. Big trucks? Very big trucks. Annie considered that carefully. My grandpa used to say trucks mean business. Your grandpa sounds like he understood the economy. Annie nodded proudly. He fixed engines. That explains it. Lulu suddenly stretched, waking slightly. The puppy blinked up at Ethan, confused for a moment. Then his tail began wagging. Ethan hid. Well, he said softly. Good evening to you too. The puppy licked Ethan's wrist. Once, then again. Ethan squinted at him. That is not an appropriate greeting protocol. Annie giggled. He's saying hello. He already said hello earlier. He likes saying it again. Ethan gently lifted Lulu a few inches and looked at him. You realize this is extremely irregular, he said to the puppy. Lulu responded by wagging harder. Ethan lowered him back into his lap. Annie watched carefully. You didn't give him back, she observed. That was a temporary repositioning. Sure. Ethan leaned back again on the bench. You know, Annie, I haven't owned a dog in my entire life. You said one bit you. Yes. Maybe Lulu is apologizing for that dog. Ethan paused. That is a surprisingly thoughtful interpretation. Annie looked down at the puppy. He looked sorry. Lulu sneezed softly. Ethan chuckled under his breath. Well, Lulu, he said, Your public relations strategy is impressive. Annie sat carefully on the far edge of the bench now. Ethan noticed but didn't comment. For a moment, the three of them simply sat there. The lake breeze carried the smell of water and autumn leaves. A man walked his golden retriever along the path nearby. Lulu lifted his head slightly to watch. Ethan noticed something then. The bench no longer felt empty. For years, Ethan had sat in parks, airports, boardrooms, and restaurants by himself without thinking about it. Solitude had become routine, efficient, predictable. But now there was a small girl beside him and a tiny dog curled against his coat. And somehow the quiet felt different. "Annie," Ethan said after a moment. "Yes. What happens if I say no?" Annie thought about that. "I'll keep looking." "For how long?" "Until someone says yes. And if nobody does?" Annie looked down at Lulu. "Then," she answered honestly, "then I'll try again tomorrow." Ethan studied her face. There was no drama there, just determination. "You really don't want to leave him alone again," he said. "No." "Why?" Annie shrugged gently. "Because someone left him once already." The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Ethan looked down at Lulu again. The puppy had curled up once more, completely relaxed. Trusting, without thinking, Ethan began lightly scratching the puppy's neck. Lulu's tail thumped softly against Ethan's coat. Annie watched quietly. "You're getting good at that," she said. Ethan hid. "Yes," he admitted. "I appear to be improving." The sun slipped behind the trees. The first evening lights of the city flickered on in the distance. Ethan looked toward the skyline, then back at the little dog. "Well," he said slowly, "this may require a trial period." Annie's eyes widened slightly. "A trial period?" "Yes." "For Lulu?" "Yes." Annie smiled. "That sounds like a yes." Ethan shook his head. "That sounds like a temporary evaluation." Lulu wagged his tail. Annie stood up from the bench. "I think Lulu agrees." Ethan looked down at the puppy again. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan Caldwell felt something unfamiliar. Not responsibility, not pressure, something quieter. The feeling that perhaps this small, unexpected interruption in his perfectly structured life might actually be the beginning of something good. Ethan Caldwell did not make important decisions lightly. That had been true when he built his company, when he bought his first warehouse, when he fired people who failed him, and when he signed contracts worth more money than most families would see in 3 lifetimes. He believed in structure, in caution, in thinking 3 steps ahead. And yet, as he sat on a bench in Riverside Park with a puppy named Lulu asleep in his lap, none of that training seemed especially useful. The evening air had turned cooler. The last of the sunlight had faded from the lake, leaving the water dark and smooth beneath a pale sky. Streetlights had begun to glow along the path, soft and golden against the deepening blue. Annie stood beside the bench, hands folded in front of her now, watching Ethan with the patient seriousness only children could manage. "A trial period," she repeated, as though tasting the words. "Yes," Ethan said. "A temporary arrangement." Annie smiled a little. "That still sounds like a yes. It sounds like a cautious yes. That's still mostly a yes." Ethan looked at her, then at Lulu, then back at her. "You negotiate like an attorney. My mom says I ask too many questions. Your mother may be underestimating the scale of the problem." Annie giggled. It was a small sound, but bright. Ethan noticed how easily it changed the air around them. He had spent years in rooms where people laughed for strategic reasons. Investors laughed because they wanted something. Reporters laughed because they needed warmth before asking for something sharp. Even charity board members laughed with careful timing, aware of who was in the room and who might write a check. But Annie's laughter had none of that in it. It belonged entirely to the moment. Lulu stirred again and lifted his head. His ears twitched as though he had just remembered where he was. He blinked up at Ethan, yawned wide enough to show a row of tiny white teeth, then placed both front paws on Ethan's chest and licked his chin before Ethan could move away. Ethan recoiled slightly. "Oh no," he said, wiping his face with visible alarm. "Absolutely not." Annie burst into laughter again. "He likes you a lot. That is not the interpretation I would choose." Lulu wagged his tail so hard his whole body moved with it. Ethan sighed and picked the puppy up carefully, holding him out in front of him for inspection. Lulu looked back at him with complete innocence. "You," Ethan said, "appear to have no understanding of personal boundaries." Lulu sneezed. Annie nodded as if this proved something. "He's little." He doesn't know the rules yet. That makes two of us, Ethan muttered. He lowered the puppy back into his lap, though a little more carefully this time, as if he were already learning where Lulu fit best. Annie took a small step closer. So, she said, what happens now? Ethan asked the question back to himself before answering her. What happened now? That was the inconvenient part. If he took the puppy home, he would need food, a bowl, a leash, probably a bed. There would be vaccinations, a vet appointment, and likely damage to at least one expensive piece of furniture. There would be early mornings, interruptions, noise, fur, unpredictability. He disliked unpredictability, and yet the idea of handing Lulu back suddenly felt much more uncomfortable than it had 20 minutes earlier. I suppose, Ethan said slowly. The first thing that happens now is I determine whether this dog is healthy. He's hungry, Annie said. How do you know? Because he tried to eat part of my shoelace. Ethan stared at her. He what? He thought it was food. That is concerning. I know. Ethan looked at Lulu again. The puppy looked perfectly content now, but the faint outline of his ribs was visible beneath the soft fur. Once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. When was the last time he ate? Ethan asked. Annie thought for a moment. I gave him half my sandwich after school. Ethan turned to her. You gave him your lunch? Half of it. And what did you eat? The other half. He looked at her for a moment longer than he meant to. The answer was not dramatic. She had not said it for praise. She had said it because, to her, that was simply what had happened. Something about that quiet little fact settled heavily in Ethan's chest. You shouldn't have had to do that, he said. Annie shrugged. He was hungrier than me. That was the sort of sentence adults remembered for years. Ethan looked out toward the lake, then back at the girl beside him. Her shoes were worn. Her ribbon had nearly slipped loose from her curls. She was trying very hard to look grown up, but she was still only 6, and the wind was turning colder by the minute. Does your mother know where you are? He asked. She knows I go through the park. That is not exactly the same thing. Annie hesitated. I told her I'd come straight home. Ethan nodded once, and instead, you found a dog, named him Lulu, interviewed a stranger, and placed the dog in his lap. When you say it like that, Annie said, it sounds like a lot. It was a lot. Lulu rolled onto his side again. Ethan looked at the time on his watch, then stood up from the bench with the puppy still in his arms. Annie looked up quickly. Are you taking him? I am taking both of us, Ethan said. To the corner store on Michigan and Elm, because I assume they sell dog food, and because I'm not sending you home after dark without walking you at least part of the way. Annie blinked. You don't have to do that. I'm aware, but you want to. Ethan adjusted Lulu carefully against his coat. The puppy seemed perfectly satisfied with the new arrangement. That remains under review, Ethan said. Annie smiled. Together, they began walking down the path toward the park entrance. The leaves crunched lightly under Ethan's shoes. Annie walked beside him, smaller and quicker, glancing up now and then to make sure Lulu was still there. For a few moments, they walked in silence. Then Annie asked, Do you always talk like that? Like what? Like everything is a business meeting. Ethan looked down at her. Do I? A little. He considered it. That may be a professional hazard. My teacher says some people use big words when they don't want to say what they really feel. Ethan gave her a sideways glance. Your teacher is either very wise or very dangerous. She teaches 2nd grade. That doesn't rule out either possibility. Annie laughed again. The sound followed them all the way to the park gate. By the time they reached the sidewalk, the city had shifted into evening. Cars moved steadily through the intersection. A bus hissed to a stop half a block away. Somewhere nearby, someone was grilling onions, and the smell drifted warmly through the cool air. Annie pointed ahead. There's a little store there. Ethan looked where she was pointing. A neighborhood corner market sat beneath a faded green awning, its front windows glowing yellow. Convenient, he said. He glanced down at Lulu, who had already fallen asleep again in his arms. Either that dog has remarkable trust, Ethan said, or he's exhausted. Both, Annie said. Ethan believed her. He slowed near the curb and looked down at her. Annie. Yes? When we get your supplies, he said, glancing at Lulu. You are going to take me to your building, and I am going to make sure your mother knows you are safe. Annie nodded. That's fair. Good. Then, after a pause, Ethan added, And before you ask, no. This does not mean Lulu is officially staying. Annie looked up at him with bright, knowing eyes. No, she agreed politely. It just means you're buying him dinner. Ethan let out a quiet laugh he hadn't expected from himself. They crossed the street together beneath the first real lights of evening. A billionaire in a dark coat, a 6-year-old girl with too much heart for one small body, and a puppy named Lulu, who had somehow already begun rearranging both of their lives. The bell above the door of the corner market gave a tired little jingle when Ethan pushed it open with his shoulder. Warm air wrapped around them at once, carrying the mixed smells of coffee, detergent, overripe bananas, and the hot rollers turning near the counter. The store was narrow but bright, packed with shelves that seemed to lean slightly toward one another, as if they had been listening to neighborhood stories for years. Lulu stirred in Ethan's arms, blinked once, and then settled again against his coat. A woman at the register looked up over her glasses. "Well," she said, her gaze landing first on Annie, then on Ethan, then finally on the puppy. "That's a picture." Annie smiled politely. Ethan inclined his head, not entirely sure what response that kind of sentence required. The woman behind the counter recognized Annie immediately. "Hey, sugar. Your mama working late again?" Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked at Ethan once more, curious but not unfriendly. In neighborhoods like this, people noticed everything. They noticed shoes, posture, voices, and who walked in with whom. Ethan could almost feel the weight of the questions she was too polite to ask. Instead, she only said, "Dog food's aisle 3. Pet bowls are near the back." "Thank you," Ethan replied. He started toward the aisle, then glanced at Annie. "You seem to know everyone." Annie followed beside him. "Miss Bernice knows everybody. That appears efficient. She also knows who steals chips. I imagine that's a useful civic function." Annie giggled softly. Aisle 3 contained exactly 4 kinds of dog food. 2 of them in dented cans, and 1 clearly intended for dogs much larger than Lulu. Ethan stared at the shelf with the expression of a man reviewing an unfavorable contract. "Do puppies eat regular dog food?" he asked. "I think they eat little food," Annie said. "That is not medically specific." Lulu opened one eye as if to suggest he was willing to be flexible. Ethan picked up a bag decorated with a cartoon spaniel. "Chicken and rice formula," he read. "That sounds reasonably harmless." Annie peered at the label. "It says puppy. Then that seems promising." He placed the bag beneath one arm and continued down the aisle. They found 2 stainless steel bowls, a small bag of soft treats, a red leash, and after a brief debate, a tiny red collar. Annie's face brightened when she saw it. "You remembered. I remember that you said red means he belongs." "It does." Ethan glanced down at the collar in his hand. It was simple, cheap, nothing like the carefully selected objects in his home, each one chosen by designers or assistants or people who believed beauty should look expensive. Yet the little red collar seemed to carry more meaning than half the things in his penthouse. He added it to the basket. By the time they reached the register, Lulu had finally woken up for good. He sat up in Ethan's arms and looked around with sleepy curiosity, then tried to chew the edge of Ethan's coat button. "That," Ethan said, gently redirecting the puppy's mouth, "is Italian wool. You are not qualified to eat it." Miss Bernice gave a low chuckle as she rang up the items. "He's cute enough to get away with a lot," she said. "That is my concern," Ethan replied. Annie leaned on the counter slightly. "Can Lulu have a little cup of water?" Miss Bernice smiled. "For that face?" "Of course he can." She disappeared behind the counter and came back with a paper cup half full of water. Lulu drank as if he had been waiting all day for permission. Ethan watched him for a moment. "Hungry and thirsty," he said quietly. "He must have been out there longer than we thought." Annie nodded, her voice softer now. "I know." Miss Bernice placed the receipt in the bag, then looked at Ethan more directly. "You walking her home?" "Yes," Ethan said. She gave one brief nod, apparently satisfied. "Good. No more questions than that." Something about her tone struck him. It was not approval exactly. It was neighborhood accountability. A quiet kind. The sort that said, "We see each other here. We pay attention." As they stepped back outside, the evening had deepened into that blue-gray hour when city lights begin to matter. Cars moved through the intersection with steady purpose. Apartment windows glowed above the street. Somewhere farther down the block, a radio played old soul music through an open storefront. Annie pointed down the sidewalk. This way. Ethan adjusted the bags in one hand and Lulu in the other. The walk was not long, but it crossed a line he rarely crossed anymore, not physically, but socially. He had spent years moving through private garages, private elevators, private offices, private dinners. Even his acts of generosity were usually filtered through foundations, boards, or carefully managed checks. Walking beside Annie through her neighborhood in the evening with dog food in one hand felt strangely more real than most of those efforts ever had. They passed a laundromat with fogged windows, a barber shop nearly closed for the night, and a church sign out front reading, "Hold on. Joy still comes in the morning." Ethan noticed Annie reading the sign as they passed. "Do you go there?" he asked. "Sometimes. With your mother?" "Yes. What do you like about it?" "The singing," Annie said. "And the old ladies who hug too hard." Ethan glanced at her. "That sounds memorable. They smell like flowers and peppermints." He found himself smiling at that. A few doors later, Annie slowed in front of a brick apartment building with chipped paint around the buzzer panel and one porch light flickering weakly above the entrance. "We're here." Ethan looked up at the building. Not dangerous, not broken, just tired. The kind of place that held people working harder than the walls suggested. "You live on which floor?" "Second." He nodded. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cooking oil, bleach, and old radiator heat. Their footsteps echoed on the narrow stairs. Annie reached the landing and stopped at a blue-painted door with a brass number 2B hanging slightly crooked. She looked up at Ethan. "My mom might be embarrassed." "About what?" "The dog stuff. Or me asking you." Ethan considered that. "I'm not here to embarrass her." Annie nodded once and unlocked the door. The apartment was small but neat. A lamp glowed beside a worn couch. On the tiny kitchen table sat a stack of unopened mail, a mug with dried coffee at the bottom, and a folded pair of scrubs. A casserole dish covered in foil rested near the stove, probably left by a neighbor or church friend. The television was off. The silence carried the shape of exhaustion. "Mom?" Annie called. No answer. Annie set the new supplies carefully by the wall. "She's not back yet." Ethan checked the time. "How late does she usually work?" "Sometimes 7. Sometimes later if somebody calls out." He frowned slightly. "You're here alone?" Annie nodded, then added quickly, "Just for a little while. Miss Ruth from downstairs checks on me." As if summoned by name, there was a knock at the door. Annie brightened and opened it. A woman in her late 60s stood there in house slippers and a long cardigan, holding a plate covered with another sheet of foil. "Well, there you are," she said. "I was about to come looking." She stopped when she saw Ethan, and then Lulu. Her eyebrows rose. "Well now," she said, taking in the entire scene with one practiced glance. "This is not what I expected." "Miss Ruth," Annie said quickly, "this is Ethan Caldwell, and this is Lulu." "The dog introduced himself already," Miss Ruth said dryly. Ethan shifted the bags to his other hand and offered a courteous nod. "Good evening." Miss Ruth looked from his coat to his shoes to his face, then back to Annie. She was doing exactly what Miss Bernice had done, taking inventory, measuring intent. Finally, she stepped inside. "I'm Ruth Palmer," she said. "I live downstairs. Danielle asked me to keep an ear out when she gets double shifts." "That seems wise," Ethan replied. "It usually is." Lulu, traitorously social, wagged at her too. Miss Ruth set the covered plate on the table and looked at the dog food on the floor. "So," she said, turning toward Annie, "I'm guessing the dog problem has developed. Maybe into a dog solution," Annie said hopefully. Miss Ruth gave a small sound that might have been amusement. Then the apartment door opened again. Danielle Carter stepped inside, tired enough that she didn't notice Ethan at first. Her scrubs were wrinkled from a long shift, and there was the unmistakable slump of a person who had spent the day caring for everybody except herself. Then she looked up. She saw Annie. She saw Miss Ruth. She saw Ethan Caldwell standing in her living room with a puppy in his arms and a red collar and a shopping bag. And for one long, suspended second, no one said anything at all. Danielle Carter stood in the doorway with one hand still on the knob, the cold evening air slipping in behind her. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes took in the room in careful pieces. Annie near the table, Miss Ruth in her cardigan and slippers, A tall white man in an expensive dark coat standing in the middle of her small living room, and a tiny golden puppy in his arms, as if the whole scene made perfect sense. Then her gaze landed on Annie. Annie. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the unmistakable strain of a mother who had arrived home already tired and had no room left in the day for surprises. Annie stepped forward immediately. "Mom, I can explain." Danielle shut the door behind her and set her purse on the chair by the wall. "I hope so." Lulu chose that exact moment to let out a soft yip and wag his tail. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. "Oh Lord, Miss." Ruth gave a small, sympathetic pat on Danielle's shoulder as she passed. "It's not as bad as it looks," she said. Danielle opened her eyes and looked around the room again. "It looks like my 6-year-old brought home a dog, recruited a stranger, and somehow turned this apartment into a rescue mission." Miss Ruth tilted her head. "Well," she said, "when you put it that way, that's not entirely inaccurate." Despite herself, Danielle almost smiled. Almost. Then she looked at Ethan. He noticed at once what exhaustion had done to her. The careful way she held herself upright. The faint compression marks on the bridge of her nose from a mask worn too long. The dry ache in her eyes. She was a woman who had spent all day tending to other people's needs and had come home expecting at least one thing to be simple. Instead, she found him. Ethan inclined his head politely. "Good evening. My name is Ethan Caldwell." Danielle's expression shifted very slightly. She knew the name, not because she followed business news, but because Chicago was the sort of city where certain names floated through conversations whether people wanted them to or not. Hospitals got supplies from companies like his. Neighborhood development meetings mentioned men like him. People with money had a way of existing in the edges of everybody else's lives. Still, she did not seem impressed. She just looked at Annie. "You met Mr. Caldwell where?" "In the park." Danielle slowly turned back toward Ethan. "In the park?" "Yes. With my dog," Annie added quickly, as if that detail improved matters. Danielle pressed 2 fingers briefly to her forehead. "Annie." "He's not our dog," Annie said, then corrected herself with quiet sorrow. "He can't be." Danielle let out a tired breath. "Baby, I told you that for a reason." "I know. Then why is he here?" The room went quiet for a beat. Annie looked at Lulu, then at Ethan, then finally at her mother. "Because I didn't want to leave him with just anybody." Danielle's face softened, despite the fatigue. That, Ethan noticed, was the dangerous part of Annie. She didn't argue like a child. She loved like one plainly, completely, with no strategy at all. It made resistance harder than it ought to be. Danielle looked at Ethan again. "I'm sorry she dragged you into this." "She didn't drag me," Ethan said calmly. "She asked." Miss Ruth made a low sound in the back of her throat that might have meant, "Fair enough." Danielle slipped out of her coat and laid it over the chair. Her movements were slow now, measured by tiredness. "Annie, why don't you wash your hands?" "I already did." "Then wash them again." Annie understood what that meant. Grown-up conversation. She nodded and disappeared into the tiny bathroom off the hallway. Danielle waited until the water ran before she spoke again. "Mr. Effett, Caldwell, thank you for walking her home. That was kind. But I hope you understand this can't become something complicated." Ethan looked down at Lulu, who had wriggled higher against his chest. "I'm beginning to understand that complicated arrived before I did." That earned the faintest hint of a smile from Miss Ruth. Danielle crossed her arms loosely, not defensive so much as trying to hold herself together. "My daughter has a very big heart," she said. "Sometimes bigger than our circumstances. She told me as much without quite meaning to." Danielle glanced at the dog supplies by the wall. The bowls, the leash, the food. The little red collar still in its packaging. Her eyes paused there. "You bought all that?" "Yes." "Why?" Ethan considered giving a practical answer, but none of the practical ones felt honest enough. "Because he was hungry," he said. "And because your daughter had already given him half her sandwich." Danielle's gaze shifted to Annie's roomless little corner of the apartment, then back to Ethan. "She did what?" She seemed to think he needed it more. Danielle closed her eyes again, but this time it wasn't frustration. It was the deep, weary ache of a mother who loved her child fiercely and knew exactly where that child had learned to put others first. "She gets that from my father," Danielle said quietly. "And a little from me, I guess." Miss Ruth moved toward the stove. I'm heating this casserole before I go, she announced. That child's probably hungry. And so are you. Danielle opened her eyes. You don't have to do that. Hush, Miss Ruth replied. That's why the Lord made old women in ovens. Ethan almost smiled. Danielle noticed. The expression on her face shifted again, just slightly, as though she had expected stiffness from him. Distance, maybe, but not warmth. From the bathroom, Annie called out, Mom, am I in trouble? Danielle exhaled. We'll discuss the meaning of trouble later. Okay. The faucet shut off. Danielle looked back at Ethan. What exactly did Annie say to you? The truth of it sounded strange even now. She walked up to me in Riverside Park holding the puppy and asked, Can you take my dog instead of me? Danielle stared at him. Then she laughed once under her breath. The tired kind of laugh that comes from recognition. That sounds exactly like Annie. She also told me I looked lonely. Danielle's eyebrows lifted. Oh, she did. Did she? She did. And did you? Ethan paused. The apartment was small enough that silence felt immediate in it. Not empty. Just honest. The table had scratches from daily use. A church calendar hung on the wall. One kitchen drawer didn't close all the way. There was something deeply uncurated about the room. And for perhaps the first time that day, Ethan did not feel the need to perform competence inside it. Yes, he said finally. I suppose I did. Danielle studied him for a moment. Not his coat, not the watch, not the name. Him. She notices things, Danielle said. More than I'd like sometimes, I had the impression. Annie reappeared in the doorway, hands damp, face expectant. Am I still in medium trouble or big trouble? Miss Ruth laughed outright this time. Danielle looked at her daughter and let some of the steel leave her shoulders. Medium, she said. Annie nodded solemnly. That's fair. Then her eyes drifted to Lulu. The puppy saw her and instantly began wagging, nearly launching himself out of Ethan's arms. Annie smiled so quickly it was like watching a light turn on. Ethan noticed Danielle see that too. There were many kinds of poverty in a city like Chicago. Money was only one of them. There was the poverty of time, of rest, of help, of margin. Danielle Carter seemed familiar with all of them, but one thing was unmistakably rich in this room: the love between mother and daughter. Danielle sat down heavily at the table. All right, she said. Tell me exactly what happened from the moment she found him. So Annie did. She told it in pieces, with interruptions and gestures. While Miss Ruth spooned casserole onto plates, and Lulu alternated between wriggling toward Annie and settling deeper into Ethan's hold. Annie described the crying sounds in the grass, the walk home, her mother saying no, the trip to the park, the lonely man on the bench, and the moment Lulu apparently made his own decision. When she got to the part about placing the dog in Ethan's lap, Danielle closed her eyes and shook her head. That was very bold. I was helping, Annie said. You were improvising. It worked. Danielle looked at Ethan. He answered the question she hadn't asked. Yes, he said. It did. Another quiet settled over the room, this one warmer than before. The casserole smelled like cheese and pepper, and the sort of comfort that came from making one dish stretch farther than it should. Lulu had finally calmed enough to let Ethan place him gently on the kitchen floor, where he immediately toddled toward Annie's shoes and sat on them as if guarding something precious. Annie looked down, delighted. He likes staying near people. He does, Ethan said. Danielle followed the puppy with her eyes. Then she looked at the dog food, then at the little red collar, then back at Ethan. You really were serious. I'm not in the habit of buying supplies, ironically. That won a real smile from Miss Ruth, and, to Danielle's visible annoyance, the corner of Danielle's own mouth twitched too. Outside, somewhere down the block, a siren passed and faded. Inside, the apartment felt smaller than before, but not in a bad way. More occupied, more alive. Danielle rested her forearms on the table. Mr. Caldwell, she said carefully. I don't know what Annie expected when she walked up to you in that park. But I do know this: we can't keep that dog here. Not legally, not financially, not any way that lasts. Ethan nodded once. I understand. Annie's face fell, though she tried to hide it. Danielle saw it at once. She reached over and touched her daughter's hand. That doesn't mean he won't be all right. Annie looked from her mother to Ethan. and the next words mattered more than anyone in the room wanted to admit. Will he still have the red collar? Ethan looked at Annie for a moment before answering. Yes, he said quietly. He'll still have the red collar. The relief that crossed her face was small, but unmistakable. Children did not always ask the biggest question first. Sometimes they asked the one that held the rest of their hope inside it. Annie looked down at Lulu, who had now planted himself firmly against her shoes, as if he had already chosen his place in the room. Danielle let out a slow breath and leaned back in her chair. All right, she said. Then let's be clear about what we're talking about. Miss Ruth set down the last plate of casserole and took her own seat without asking permission from anybody. She had the air of a woman who had earned that right years ago. We are talking, Danielle continued, about a puppy my daughter found on the street, a building that does not allow pets, a bank account that does not stretch, and a stranger from the park who somehow ended up buying dog food. A concise summary, Ethan said. Danielle gave him a look that suggested she was still deciding whether his calm tone was reassuring or irritating. And, she added, we are talking about a 6-year-old who gets attached fast. Annie sat up straighter. I don't get attached fast. Miss Ruth looked at her over her glasses. You named him Lulu in under an hour. Annie considered that. That's different. It never is, Miss Ruth murmured. Ethan glanced down at the puppy again. Lulu had found one of Annie's shoelaces and was mouthing it with determined concentration. That seems unhygienic, Ethan said. He thinks everything is food, Annie replied. That is becoming clear. Danielle rested her chin briefly in her hand. I'm not trying to be difficult, she said. I just need to be realistic. Annie hears things with her heart first. I don't always have that luxury. I understand realism, Ethan said. Danielle gave a tired, knowing smile. I imagine you do. He looked around the apartment again. The neat stack of unopened mail, the repaired curtain hem, the church calendar with 2 dates circled in blue ink. Nothing in the room was careless. Everything had been stretched, reused, preserved, managed. This was not a home without discipline. It was a home where discipline had simply never been optional. What would realism look like here? Ethan asked. Danielle answered without hesitation. Realism looks like Lulu not sleeping in this apartment tonight. Annie lowered her eyes. It also looks like... Danielle went on. Softer now. My daughter not thinking she failed him. That changed the room. Ethan saw Annie lift her head again just slightly, as if those words mattered more than the others. You didn't fail him, Danielle said, turning toward her daughter fully now. Do you hear me? Annie nodded once, but I had to give him away. No, Danielle said gently. You tried to make sure he was safe. That's not the same thing. Lulu, entirely unaware of the emotional stakes, sneezed and sat down abruptly on the kitchen floor. Annie smiled despite herself. Miss Ruth pointed her fork toward Ethan. And what does realism look like in your world, Mr. Caldwell? He was not often asked questions that directly in private homes. Usually people asked around him, not at him. He folded one hand over the other and answered honestly. In my world, realism usually means I can solve a problem with money, lawyers, or logistics. Miss Ruth nodded. And can you solve this one that way? Ethan looked at Lulu, then at Annie, then at Danielle. Yes, he said. The practical part of it, certainly. Danielle's gaze sharpened a little. The practical part. Yes. And the rest? He considered that. The rest, he said slowly, depends on whether Lulu is simply a dog in need of a home, or whether he has already become something more important than that. Nobody spoke for a moment. Annie reached down and scooped Lulu gently into her lap. The puppy immediately settled against her as if returning to a place he understood. He's not just a dog, she whispered. Danielle looked at her daughter with that complicated mixture. Only mothers seemed able to manage love, worry, pride, and grief all folded into one expression. I know, she said. The casserole sat warm on the plates now. Miss Ruth began serving Annie before anyone could object. Eat, she said. Nobody makes wise decisions hungry. That, Ethan said, is the soundest policy statement I've heard all day. Miss Ruth handed him a plate too. He looked at it as if unsure what to do. Go on, she said. You bought the dog food. Least we can do is feed the man. Danielle shook her head a little, almost smiling. You don't have to stay. Ethan glanced from her to Annie, and then to Lulu. I think I do. At least until we've settled what happens next. Danielle studied him. There was caution in her. And not without reason. Men with money often arrived in other people's lives with solutions that felt more like control. Offers could become obligations. Kindness could turn condescending very quickly. Ethan recognized the look because he had earned versions of it from many people before, so he kept his tone careful. I'm not here to override you, he said. He's your daughter. You make the decision. I'm only saying the puppy won't go hungry tonight. That landed better. Danielle took a seat again and accepted the plate Miss Ruth placed in front of her. All right, she said quietly. Then maybe we start there. They ate. For a little while, the apartment sounded like forks against plates. A chair shifting across old linoleum, Annie whispering things to Lulu between bites. Ethan had not eaten casserole in years. The food was simple and hot and deeply familiar in a way he had forgotten food could be. It tasted like school nights, church basements, weathering things together. Not elegant, not curated, just honest. Miss Ruth watched him notice that and gave a small nod, as if confirming some private suspicion about him. Annie looked up midway through dinner. If Lulu stays with Mr. Caldwell, she asked. Can I still see him? Danielle set down her fork. Annie. No, that's a fair question, Ethan said. Danielle glanced at him. He continued. If Lulu stays with me, then yes. I think seeing him would be good for both of you. Annie brightened immediately. Really? Yes. How much? Ethan almost smiled. That would depend on schedules, school, and what your mother is comfortable with. Annie turned to Danielle at once. I'm comfortable with a lot, Danielle said dryly. As long as it involves homework getting done and nobody turning my life into a surprise. That seems reasonable, Ethan said. Miss Ruth leaned back in her chair. You know, she said, there are arrangements in life that don't fit neat categories, but they still turn out right. Danielle glanced at her. You mean like what? I mean like neighbors who become family, teachers who become lifelines, church ladies who become emergency childcare, whether anybody planned it or not. She looked at Lulu. And maybe dogs who belong to more than one broken place at a time. That sentence lingered. Ethan saw Annie absorb it without fully understanding why it mattered. Danielle understood it immediately. There are times, Ethan thought, when wealth builds walls so high, a person forgets how many ordinary miracles happen without contracts. He finished the last bite on his plate and set down the fork. Tomorrow, he said, I can take Lulu to a veterinarian. Make sure he's healthy. Vaccinations, age estimate, whatever he needs. Danielle opened her mouth to protest on principle, then closed it again. That would help, she admitted. I know a clinic near downtown that handles rescue intake well. Miss Ruth pointed at him with satisfaction. There, that's a useful rich person sentence. Annie giggled. Danielle rubbed her forehead. I should probably object to the phrasing, but not the offer, Miss Ruth replied. Danielle looked at Ethan again. The caution was still there, but now it sat beside exhaustion and the beginning of gratitude, which was often the harder emotion to manage with dignity. I don't want Annie thinking this ends like a fairy tale, Danielle said quietly. Ethan looked at Annie, who was now feeding Lulu one tiny corner of macaroni under the table when she thought nobody could see. I don't think it does, he said. Danielle frowned slightly. What do you think it is? Ethan considered the question longer than the others expected. I think, he said at last, it might be one good decision followed by another. That's usually how real lives change. Nobody answered immediately, but something in the room softened. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows. Inside, the lamp cast a warm circle over the table, over the tired dishes, and the little red collar still waiting in its package. Over a mother trying not to hope too carelessly, a child already hoping with everything she had, and a man who had not expected to feel needed in a room like this. Annie looked up at him suddenly. Can Lulu wear the collar tonight? Danielle started to say no. Ethan, perhaps unwisely, said, I think that can be arranged. Annie beamed. Lulu wagged as if he had understood every word. And somewhere beneath Danielle Carter's caution, beneath Ethan Caldwell's carefully organized life, and beneath Annie's fierce little heart, something new had begun to take shape. Not ownership, not rescue, something quieter, something closer to belonging. Danielle opened the package with the red collar more carefully than the object required. It was a simple thing, no more expensive than a sandwich and a cup of coffee. But in the small pool of lamplight over the kitchen table, it seemed to carry a weight all its own. Annie leaned forward in her chair, hardly breathing. Lulu, meanwhile, had discovered the table leg and was gnawing it with mild determination. "Absolutely not," Ethan said, bending to lift the puppy away from the wood. "That is a structural element." Lulu blinked at him and licked his thumb in response. Miss Ruth laughed into her tea. "You keep talking to that dog like he's an intern." "In my experience," Ethan replied, turning the collar over in his hands, "interns are far less cheerful." Annie slid off her chair and came around beside him. "Can I help?" Danielle opened her mouth, perhaps to say Annie had already helped enough for one day. But what came out instead was softer. "Wash your hands again first, baby." "I already did." "I know. Do it anyway." Annie obeyed with the long-suffering dignity of a child who understood that sometimes being told twice was simply part of being loved. While she was gone, Danielle watched Ethan crouch near the kitchen chair with Lulu in one hand and the red collar in the other. "You really don't have to do all this," she said quietly. Ethan looked up. "That may be true. Then why are you?" It was not a suspicious question this time. It was more difficult than that. It was honest. Ethan looked down at Lulu, who was trying very hard to bite the loose end of the collar. "For a long time," he said, not yet sure why he was answering so plainly. "I told myself that if a problem wasn't mine, it was better not to step too close. Cleaner that way. Safer." Danielle listened without interrupting. "And then your daughter walked up to me in a park," he continued, holding a puppy in her sweater, "and spoke to me as if the world still worked on basic trust." Miss Ruth made a soft sound of approval. Danielle's expression shifted, just a little. "That'll do it," she murmured. Annie came back from the bathroom with damp hands and serious concentration. "I'm ready." Ethan handed her the buckle side of the collar. "Very well," he said. "You may assist." Together, they fastened the red collar around Lulu's small neck. The puppy sat remarkably still for a creature who had shown no respect at all for table legs, shoelaces, or expensive coat buttons. When it was done, Annie leaned back and smiled with the kind of satisfaction only children and artists seemed able to produce. "He looks like he belongs now," she whispered. The room went quiet again. Belonging. It was a dangerous word in certain kinds of lives. For people who had too little, it could mean risk. For people who had too much, it could mean responsibility. Ethan knew enough to recognize both. Lulu shook once, making the little metal tag ring faintly against the buckle. Then he trotted in an uncertain circle, clearly aware that something about him had changed. Miss Ruth nodded. "Well," she said, "he's official enough for one night." Danielle glanced at the clock on the stove. It was later than she liked Annie to be up on a school night. Ethan could see that calculation moving behind her eyes, the endless arithmetic of a single mother. Bedtime, dishes, tomorrow's lunch, morning alarm, bus money, clean socks, one more load of laundry if she still had the energy. "I should get Annie settled," she said. Annie immediately looked worried. "Do I have to go to bed right now?" "You have school tomorrow." "But Lulu will still exist in 10 minutes. Annie considered this and seemed reluctantly willing to accept it. Ethan stood, brushing a little puppy fur from his coat. He was startled by how natural that motion already felt. "I should go as well," he said. Annie turned quickly. "Are you taking him now?" The question landed in the room with more force than its size suggested. Danielle looked at Ethan, waiting. He glanced down at Lulu, who had now curled around one of Annie's shoes as if he had appointed himself her personal guardian. Not rescue, he thought again. Not ownership. Something messier and more human than either. "I think," Ethan said slowly, "for tonight, it would be better if Lulu came with me." Annie's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Danielle saw it immediately and stepped closer to her daughter. "Baby," but Annie wasn't crying. Not yet. She was doing something far harder. She was trying to be brave before the sadness arrived. "Because of the apartment," she said quietly. "Yes," Danielle answered. "And because if the landlord sees him..." "Yes." Annie nodded once, absorbing the logic she had already known from the beginning. Then she crouched down and picked Lulu up. The puppy wriggled happily, unaware that he was becoming the center of a child's first serious practice in letting go. Annie buried her face briefly against his neck. "You have to be good," she whispered to him. "Don't chew things that matter." Ethan almost smiled. "That advice may come too late." Annie stroked Lulu's ears. "And don't cry if it's too quiet." The room grew still. That sentence was not really for the dog. Danielle's face changed when she heard it. Miss Ruth looked down into her tea. Ethan felt something in his chest pull tight in a way he was not accustomed to. Annie lifted her eyes to him. "Do you have a quiet house?" Ethan answered truthfully. "Yes." She nodded as if she had expected that. "Then maybe talk to him sometimes." Ethan took Lulu carefully from her arms. The puppy looked from one face to another, then settled against Ethan's chest with alarming ease. "I can do that," Ethan said. Annie looked at the red collar one more time and reached up to straighten it. "Do you promise he won't be by himself all night?" Danielle started to intervene, perhaps to say that adults should not make promises they were not certain they could keep, but Ethan answered before she could. "I promise." It was a small word, spoken in a small apartment over a sleeping neighborhood, but Ethan felt it land with unusual gravity. He did not make promises lightly. Somewhere along the line, success had taught him that certainty was best left to contracts and weatherproof materials. Yet this promise felt cleaner than most agreements he had ever signed. Annie seemed to know that too. She gave one short nod, as if filing the promise away where she kept things that mattered. Miss Ruth stood and began gathering plates. "Well," she announced, "if this isn't the strangest Tuesday I've had in months, it's at least the sweetest." Danielle walked Ethan to the door while Annie knelt on the floor, giving Lulu one final series of whispered instructions about blankets, breakfast, and what kind of people were safe. At the door, Danielle lowered her voice. "She's going to ask about him before she asks about me tomorrow morning." "I suspect that's true," Ethan said. A tired smile touched her face. "She doesn't mean it in a hurtful way." "I know." Danielle looked at Lulu, then back at Ethan. "I don't know what this is yet. Neither do I. And I'm not in the habit of letting strangers into my daughter's life." "That seems wise." She studied him for a moment. Not the billionaire, not the public name, just the man standing in her hallway with a puppy wearing a red collar. "She trusted you fast," Danielle said. "I noticed. She doesn't always." That mattered. Ethan understood that much, even without asking why. "I'll bring him by the park tomorrow after school," he said, "assuming the veterinary appointment doesn't reveal he's secretly a wolf." Danielle let out a tired laugh. That would be inconvenient for all involved. Her hand rested on the doorknob, but she didn't open it yet. "Thank you," she said quietly. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thank you people rehearsed. It came from deeper than that. From the narrow place where dignity and exhaustion learned to stand side by side. Ethan inclined his head. "You're welcome." When he finally stepped into the hallway, the building felt quieter than before. Not empty, just winding down into itself. Below, somewhere on the first floor, a television played softly. A child laughed in another apartment. Pipes clicked behind the walls. Lulu lifted his head once, taking in the unfamiliar sounds, then tucked his nose beneath Ethan's chin. By the time Ethan reached the sidewalk, the city had become all evening. Streetlights glowed amber along the block. The air smelled faintly of cold brick, car exhaust, and someone frying onions a few buildings over. His driver was not here. His schedule had not anticipated any of this. He would need to either call the car service or walk farther than he had intended. Instead of annoyance, he felt something stranger. Reluctance. Not to leave the neighborhood. To leave the feeling of it. He looked down at Lulu. The puppy blinked up at him from inside the fold of his coat, the red collar bright against the pale gold of his fur. "Well," Ethan said quietly as he started walking toward the avenue, "you appear to have acquired a second life before dinner." Lulu licked the edge of his jaw. Ethan said, "Yes," he murmured. "And perhaps I've acquired something too." Above him, the windows of the city glowed one by one in the dark, each one holding a separate life, a separate story, a separate loneliness. For years, Ethan Caldwell had passed through those lights as if they belonged to another species of people. Tonight, carrying a puppy named Lulu through the cold Chicago air, he felt if only for a moment less like a man above the city and more like a man inside it. And in apartment 2B, a 6-year-old girl was climbing into bed knowing that somewhere, in a quiet house she had never seen, something she loved was not alone. Ethan Caldwell had forgotten how much noise a small creature could make inside a quiet home. By the time he reached his penthouse, Lulu had yawned twice, sneezed once, licked Ethan's hand 3 more times, and made a determined attempt to chew through the corner of a leather glove that had cost more than Annie and her mother probably spent on groceries in a week. None of that prepared Ethan for what happened when the elevator doors opened onto the private foyer of his apartment. Lulu froze. So did Ethan. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The penthouse spread behind Ethan in its usual immaculate silence, soft recessed lighting, polished wood floors, clean lines, a city view arranged like framed glass beyond the windows. It was the kind of home interior magazines described as elegant, restrained, intentional. Tonight it looked exactly what Annie had guessed it was. Lonely. Lulu made a small sound, not quite a whimper, and pressed himself closer against Ethan's coat. Ethan stepped inside and the automatic lights brightened. "There," he said quietly, closing the door behind them. "This is home. Temporarily." The word sounded weaker than he intended. Lulu blinked at the wide-open room with the uncertain seriousness of a very small animal who understood that he had crossed into unknown territory. Ethan loosened his coat and lowered the puppy carefully to the floor. For 3 seconds, Lulu did not move. Then he toddled across the nearest rug, lost his balance on the edge, corrected himself, and marched straight toward the living room as if conducting an inspection. Ethan followed with the shopping bag still in one hand. "No," he said as Lulu disappeared behind the couch. "You do not get to own the place before I do." A moment later, the puppy popped back out, triumphant and entirely pleased with himself. Ethan set the dog food and bowls on the kitchen island and looked around his apartment with new eyes. Earlier that morning, the place had seemed orderly, predictable, controlled. Now it looked like a museum waiting for trouble. Lulu was, in every possible sense, trouble. The puppy had found the leg of a dining chair and was chewing it with complete optimism. Ethan crossed the floor in 3 long steps and scooped him up. "No," he said again. "That is walnut." Lulu licked Ethan's chin in response. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "You are not responsive to correction." He carried Lulu into the kitchen and set him down beside the new bowls. Then he crouched, opened the bag of puppy food, and frowned immediately. The instructions on the side were absurdly specific. Weight, age, portion size, frequency. Lulu, who could not possibly weigh much more than a handbag, sat on Ethan's shoe and looked up expectantly. "This," Ethan said, reading the label, "is why I preferred industries with spreadsheets." Still, he filled one bowl with water and another with what he hoped was the correct amount of food. Lulu stared for half a second, then launched himself forward with shocking enthusiasm. Ethan stayed crouched there, watching him eat. The puppy did not chew with grace. He attacked dinner like someone working through old trust issues. Little paws braced against the floor, tail wagging in relentless gratitude. Lulu devoured every piece as if the bowl might vanish without warning. Something about that hurt to watch, not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. Hunger rarely announces itself with violins. More often it shows up as a small dog eating too fast in a stranger's kitchen. Ethan reached for the water bowl and nudged it a little closer. "Slow down," he muttered. Lulu ignored him completely. When the food was gone, the puppy drank water with equal seriousness, then sat back on his haunches and looked up as if to say, "Now what?" Ethan leaned against the cabinet for a moment, arms folded. Now what? Indeed, he should have called someone. An assistant, perhaps. Or the concierge downstairs, someone who understood pet supplies, late-night veterinarians, or at the very least how often puppies needed to be taken outside. Instead, he found himself doing what Annie had suggested. He talked to the dog. "Well," he said, "I was informed that you do not like too much quiet." Lulu wagged. "That makes one of us." The puppy sneezed and trotted after Ethan as he walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beyond them, downtown Chicago shimmered with its usual cold brilliance. Headlights moved in threads below. Office towers glowed against the dark. The city looked expensive from up here, distant, almost fictional. "Bind him!" He heard the tiny clicking of Lulu's nails against the wood floor. The sound stopped. Ethan turned. Lulu had sat down in the exact center of the room and was staring at him. "What?" The puppy's tail thumped once. Ethan looked around the living room, then back at Lulu. "Don't tell me," he said slowly. "You want company already." Lulu gave a tiny bark. Ethan stared at him. "I see. He glanced toward the hallway leading to the bedroom wing, and then toward the couch, trying to determine the ethical and practical boundaries of a temporary dog arrangement. The couch was Italian leather. The dog had already attempted to eat furniture. The bedroom, however, was worse. That space had been his alone for so long it felt almost ceremonial. Lulu barked again, softer this time. Ethan sighed. This is an unreasonable amount of emotional pressure from a 4-pound animal. In the end, he carried a folded throw blanket from the guest room into the living room and placed it near the sofa. There, he said. A respectable compromise. Lulu sniffed it politely. Then, ignoring the blanket entirely, he waddled over to Ethan's shoes and sat on one of them. Ethan looked down. No. Lulu remained. Ethan sat on the couch. Lulu immediately climbed onto his foot, turned in 2 tiny circles, and curled up there. For a long time, Ethan did not move. The television stayed off. His phone buzzed twice somewhere on the kitchen counter, messages from people who expected decisions, confirmations, numbers. He ignored them. Below the windows, the city continued moving in perfect indifference. And there, in the middle of his elegantly designed silence, sat one exhausted man and one sleeping puppy wearing a cheap red collar that somehow made the entire room look less cold. Ethan leaned back slowly. He thought of Annie in apartment 2B, likely asking her mother at least 3 more questions before bed. He thought of Danielle's tired face, Miss Ruth's steady eyes, the casserole, the church calendar on the wall, the way Annie had said, "Don't cry if it's too quiet." That sentence had stayed with him all the way home. He looked down at Lulu. "It is quiet here," he admitted. The puppy opened one eye, then closed it again. Ethan rested his head against the back of the couch. "When I was a boy," he said into the silence, surprising himself with the confession, "my mother used to leave the radio on in the kitchen at night." Lulu twitched an ear. She said houses sound less empty when something is speaking softly in another room. He hadn't thought about that in years. Not his mother's voice, not the old kitchen, not the creak of floorboards in the house in Evanston before ambition and adulthood and success had stripped life down into polished surfaces and efficient schedules. Lulu made a tiny snoring sound. Ethan looked down and, very carefully, rested one hand against the puppy's side. Warm, alive, trusting. He had spent most of his adult life around people who trusted him only when contracts made it worthwhile. Investors trusted returns. Employees trusted salaries. Reporters trusted nothing. Even affection, when it came, often arrived, negotiated. But this creature had known him for less than 3 hours and already slept on his foot as if that were the most natural thing in the world. The thought was both absurd and strangely humbling. His phone buzzed again. This time he stood, reached for it, glanced at the screen, and silenced it without reading the messages. When he turned back, Lulu was awake and looking at him. "Do you need something?" Ethan asked. Lulu yawned. Then, with unshakable confidence, he trotted toward the hallway and stopped, waiting. Ethan stared at him. "No." Lulu stayed where he was. "No," Ethan repeated. "You are not dictating room assignments." Lulu wagged once. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. "This is exactly how standards collapse." Still, he followed. The puppy led him down the hall, into the bedroom, and immediately toward the side of the bed. There he sat, looking up expectantly. Ethan looked at the dog, then at the bed, then back at the dog. "Absolutely not." Lulu sneezed. Ethan turned on the bedside lamp, retrieved another folded blanket from the linen closet, and arranged it on the floor near his side of the bed. "That is as far as I'm willing to compromise." Lulu inspected the blanket, and, to Ethan's astonishment, accepted it. Within seconds, he was curled into a golden comma, asleep again. Ethan changed slowly, brushed his teeth, and turned off the light. The room darkened except for the city glow leaking faintly through the curtains. He climbed into bed and lay there, staring at the ceiling. The apartment no longer sounded empty. It sounded different. Not louder, exactly, just occupied. After a while, he heard the soft shift of Lulu turning in his sleep. Then the faint ring of the little tag against the red collar. "Belonging," Annie had said. Ethan closed his eyes. He had no business feeling moved by a collar, a casserole, or a 6-year-old girl who seemed to understand his loneliness better than most adults ever had. And yet, down on the floor, Lulu gave one final sleepy sigh. Ethan smiled in the dark before he could stop himself. "Good night, Lulu," he said quietly. From the floor came a tiny rustle, as if the puppy had heard him. Then silence again, but not the old kind. Ethan Caldwell woke before dawn, not because of an alarm, but because something warm and insistent was pressing against his hand. For one disoriented second, he did not remember where he was in the morning. Then he heard it, a small, impatient whine from the blanket beside his bed. He opened his eyes. Lulu was standing with both front paws on the edge of the mattress, tail wagging furiously, red collar slightly crooked, looking as though he had personally been inconvenienced by the concept of sunrise. Ethan blinked toward the dark ceiling. "This," he said hoarsely, "feels unnecessary." Lulu whined again. Ethan reached for his phone on the nightstand. 5:42 a.m. He stared at the screen. He had negotiated acquisitions in 3 time zones, boarded flights before dawn, and once spent 48 hours in Seoul without sleeping more than 90 minutes. But somehow being woken by a puppy before 6 in the morning felt more unreasonable than any of it. Lulu pawed the mattress again. Ethan pushed back the blanket and sat up slowly. "I assume this is urgent." Lulu's tail wagged harder. Ethan swung his feet onto the floor and immediately felt the cold hardwood under his soles. Lulu danced backward in excited little half circles, then ran toward the bedroom door, stopped, and looked back. "You are directing this operation with far too much confidence," Ethan muttered, standing. Still, he followed. The apartment was dim and blue with pre-dawn light. The skyline beyond the windows looked softer at this hour, less like power and more like possibility. The city had not fully woken yet. Even the silence felt drowsy. Lulu trotted ahead of him through the hall and into the living room, then stopped at the front door. Ethan understood. "Well," he said, rubbing a hand over his face, "that is at least a rational request." He found the red leash still in its bag on the kitchen island, opened it with more difficulty than he cared to admit, and crouched to clip it onto Lulu's collar. The puppy stood astonishingly still, as though he already understood that this was the price of freedom. "You adapt quickly," Ethan said. Lulu licked his wrist. "That is not an answer." The elevator ride down was surreal. Ethan, usually alone at this hour with a coffee and a phone full of market updates, now stood in his dark sweater and slacks holding a leash attached to a puppy who had already tried to chew the corner of the elevator mat. At the lobby desk, the overnight concierge looked up and froze for half a beat. "Mr. Caldwell," he said carefully. "Is that a dog?" Ethan glanced down. "It appears so." The concierge, whose name Ethan embarrassingly realized he did not know, smiled despite himself. "Well," he said, "he's a handsome little guy." Lulu wagged immediately at the sound of approval. Ethan hesitated, then said, "His name is Lulu." The concierge's eyebrows lifted very slightly, but he was too well trained to comment. "Good morning, Lulu." Lulu sneezed. Ethan almost smiled. Outside, the cold air hit them both at once. The city smelled clean in that early hour: stone, lake wind, wet pavement from the night before. A few cabs rolled past. Somewhere across the street, a delivery truck was unloading bread for a cafe that had not opened yet. The sky above the buildings was beginning to pale. Not yet sunrise, but close. Lulu stopped dead on the sidewalk, overwhelmed for a moment by the size of the world. Then he began pulling enthusiastically toward the nearest patch of grass. "Not so fast," Ethan said, taking a careful step behind him. "You are very small. The city is not." Still, Lulu moved with complete faith that Ethan would follow, and Ethan did. By the time they reached the narrow landscaped strip along the side of the building, Ethan had learned 3 things. First, Lulu was more determined outdoors than indoors. Second, puppies had very little respect for leather shoes. Third, there was no graceful way for a billionaire to stand on a downtown sidewalk before 6 in the morning holding a red leash and pretending he knew what he was doing. After several minutes of confused pacing, Lulu finally accomplished what he had come outside to do. Ethan exhaled in relief. "There," he said. "A measurable success." A woman in running clothes passed by with earbuds in and gave him a cheerful nod. "Cute dog." Ethan nodded back automatically. "Thank you." It was only after she passed that he realized how ordinary the exchange had been. No one had asked about his company. No one had recognized him. No one wanted a, quote, a favor or a meeting. To the woman jogging before sunrise, He was simply a man walking a dog. The simplicity of that felt strangely pleasant. When they returned upstairs, Lulu drank water with the urgency of an athlete after competition, and then attacked breakfast with the same solemn commitment he had shown the night before. Ethan stood at the kitchen island, making coffee one-handed while keeping half an eye on the puppy. He had an 8:30 call with New York, a 10 o'clock strategy review, and lunch with 2 investors who would expect him to sound decisive about a potential expansion into St. Louis. He should have been reviewing notes already. Instead, he was standing barefoot in his own kitchen, watching a dog eat kibble and wondering whether Annie was awake yet. That thought surprised him enough that he set down the coffee scoop. He pictured apartment 2B in the soft gray light of morning, Annie likely asking about Lulu before brushing her teeth, Danielle trying to tie back curls while checking the time, packing a lunch, finding matching socks, answering questions no adult was ready for before 7 o'clock. His own mornings had become so mechanized over the years that they barely qualified as life. Shower, coffee, email, driver, elevator, boardroom, repeat. But now, in the middle of that routine, there was Lulu. And because there was Lulu, there was Annie. And because there was Annie, Ethan found himself thinking not about efficiency, but about presence. Lulu finished eating and trotted over to Ethan's feet. Then, without warning, the puppy sat directly on one of them. Ethan looked down. Again, Lulu wagged. Ethan bent and picked him up, setting him gently on the kitchen island stool cushion while he poured coffee into a mug. Lulu immediately tried to investigate the steam. No, that is adult suffering in liquid form. His phone buzzed. This time he looked. 3 emails, 2 texts, 1 message from his assistant reminding him of the revised briefing packet and asking whether he wanted the car at 7:30 or 7:45. Ethan typed back, 8:15. Morning changed. He stared at the sentence after sending it. Morning changed. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt more accurate than he liked. Lulu had now managed to climb halfway off the stool cushion and was hanging there in precarious confidence. Ethan scooped him up again. This cannot become a pattern, he said. The doorbell rang. Ethan frowned. No one came up unannounced to the penthouse. Not without good reason. He carried Lulu to the screen by the entryway and looked. A woman stood there holding a small leather bag and wearing navy scrubs under a thick winter coat. Her dark hair was pulled back, and despite the early hour, her posture carried the alert fatigue of someone who had already been awake too long. Danielle Carter. Ethan looked down at Lulu. Well, he said quietly, I suppose your world travels fast. He opened the door. Danielle stood there with one gloved hand wrapped around a paper cup of coffee and the other gripping the strap of her bag. She looked a little embarrassed to be there and too tired to hide it well. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I know this is early. Ethan glanced at Lulu, who had perked up at the sound of her voice. You're here for a reason. Danielle nodded. I had an early shift change. Miss Ruth took Annie to school. But Annie, she exhaled, then gave him a tired half-smile. Annie cried because she forgot to say good morning to the dog. Ethan looked down at Lulu again. The puppy wagged as if he approved of being missed. So, Danielle said, lifting the paper cup slightly as if to justify her arrival, I brought coffee. And I thought maybe, if it wasn't too much trouble. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Ethan stepped aside from the doorway. I think, he said, a reunion can be arranged. Danielle stepped into the penthouse with the careful hesitation of someone entering a place that did not belong to her world. The apartment was exactly what she had expected, and somehow more than that, high ceilings, soft lighting, polished surfaces, windows so large they turned the city into a silent mural. Nothing in the room was accidental. Nothing was crowded. Nothing looked used enough to be depended on. And yet the first thing Lulu did when he saw her was wiggle so hard in Ethan's arms that dignity disappeared from the entire room. Well, Danielle said softly, setting the paper cup on the kitchen island. I see he survived the night. Against all odds, Ethan replied. Lulu gave a happy squeak at the sound of her voice and twisted toward her with such determined affection that Ethan had no choice but to hand him over. Danielle took the puppy carefully, and Lulu immediately pressed his nose beneath her chin as if reporting for duty. She laughed under her breath. That's unfair, she murmured to him. You weren't supposed to get any cuter. Ethan watched the moment from across the island. There was nothing theatrical about Danielle Carter. She wore the same navy scrubs as the night before, though cleaner now, and her coat still carried the faint chill of the morning outside. Her face looked less tired than it had at midnight, but only because people could do an astonishing amount with 10 minutes, cold water, and determination. Exhaustion still lived in the corners of her eyes. He picked up the coffee she had brought. "You came armed with diplomacy." Danielle glanced at the cup. "And gratitude," she said. "Also caffeine. Mostly caffeine." Ethan took a sip. It was strong, too hot, and sweet enough to qualify as regional culture. He looked at her. "This is not how I usually drink coffee." "I figured," she said. "But this is what was open." He nodded once. "It's effective." That seemed to amuse her. Lulu, already reassured that both adults remained acceptable, wriggled in Danielle's arms and reached one paw toward Ethan as if unwilling to commit fully to either side. Danielle looked down at him. "Oh, so now you want both." "That appears to be his strategy," Ethan said. She set the puppy gently onto the floor, and Lulu immediately began trotting in uncertain circles across the living room rug, red collar bright against the pale gold of his fur. Danielle watched him for a moment, then slowly turned back toward Ethan. "I wasn't sure if coming here would be strange." "It is strange," Ethan said, "but not necessarily in a negative way." She nodded, accepting the precision of that. "I just didn't want Annie going to school upset all day." "She cried hard?" "Not loudly." Danielle leaned one hip against the island. "She tried not to, which somehow makes it worse." Ethan understood that more than he expected. She asked if Lulu thought she forgot him on purpose. Danielle added. He looked down into his coffee. "That sounds like Annie." "It does." For a moment neither of them spoke. Morning light spread slowly across the windows, turning the skyline pale silver blue. Below them, the city had begun its weekday motion in earnest cabs, buses, people with coffee cups moving toward obligations. Danielle took in the penthouse again, but this time more quietly. She noticed the folded blanket beside the couch, the new bowls by the kitchen island, the open bag of puppy food, one of Ethan's gloves on the floor where Lulu had apparently dragged it. The place was still elegant, still expensive, still meticulously designed, but the order had been interrupted, and somehow that made it feel less forbidding. "He slept out here?" she asked, nodding toward the blanket. "For approximately half the night. And the other half?" Ethan glanced toward the hallway. "He relocated his operations to my bedroom." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." It was highly unauthorized. She smiled then. Not a tired half-smile this time. A real one. Brief but unguarded. It changed her whole face. Ethan found himself looking away first. "I should thank you properly," Danielle said after a moment. "Not just for the dog. For yesterday. For walking Annie home. For not dismissing her. I'm not sure I deserve much credit. She's difficult to dismiss." Danielle let out a soft laugh. "Yes," she said. "That she is." Lulu had now found the throw blanket and was attacking one corner with moral conviction. Danielle shook her head. "He really does think everything belongs to him. That makes him surprisingly well suited to this zip code." She laughed again, and this time the sound stayed in the room a little longer. Then her face softened. "She doesn't meet many people she trusts right away," she said quietly. Ethan turned toward her. "She trusted you," Danielle continued. "Fast. I noticed that." He thought of Annie in the park, studying him with serious eyes and a certainty no adult would have dared. "You look like a good person." "I noticed it too," he said. Danielle folded her hands lightly around the warm paper cup she had brought for herself. She hasn't had a lot of room to be careless with trust. The sentence hung there. Ethan did not ask for the full story. Not because he wasn't curious. Because he knew enough to understand that some histories entered a room slowly, and only when invited. Instead, he said, "She seems older than 6 in certain moments." Danielle looked at the skyline. "She is and she isn't." That answer told him everything it needed to. Lulu finally tired of the blanket corner and came toddling back across the floor. He stopped between them, sat down, and looked up as if requesting a formal acknowledgement of his role in whatever this conversation was becoming. Danielle bent first and scooped him up. Annie wanted to know if he ate dinner. He did. Did he cry? Not especially. Did he sleep? Repeatedly. In multiple jurisdictions. That earned another laugh. Danielle looked down at Lulu, stroking one finger lightly along the red collar. She was proud of this. She should be. She thought it meant he belonged somewhere. Ethan considered the puppy in her arms, then the woman holding him, then the small but persistent presence of Annie in the room even though she was already at school. "I think," he said slowly. "She may have been right." Danielle lifted her eyes to him. There was caution still. There needed to be, but it no longer stood alone. Something else had joined it now, an unwilling hope, perhaps, or simply relief that this strange arrangement had not collapsed overnight. "I don't want her hurt," Danielle said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I know. She gets attached to living things. That seems preferable to the alternative." "It is," Danielle admitted. "But it also means that when something leaves, she feels it all the way through." Ethan looked at Lulu. The puppy was chewing on the zipper of Danielle's coat now, completely content. "I'm not planning to vanish," he said. Danielle was quiet for a beat. Then she asked the question he had known was coming. "What are you planning?" No investor had ever asked it like that. No board member had ever meant it quite so personally. Ethan rested his coffee mug on the counter and answered with more honesty than he usually permitted before 8 in the morning. "I'm planning to take Lulu to the veterinarian today," he said. "I'm planning to make sure he's healthy. I'm planning to bring him to the park after school, if that still works for you. And after that," he glanced at the puppy, "after that I'm planning to see what this becomes before I assign it a name." Danielle absorbed that quietly. "That's a very careful answer. It's the most accurate one I have." She nodded. Fair enough. The city light had grown stronger now, filling the room in a way artificial lighting never could. The penthouse no longer looked lonely in the same stark way it had the night before. It looked inhabited, not by many people, just enough. Danielle checked the time and sighed. "I should go before I'm late." Lulu, as if sensing movement, lifted his head. She kissed the top of it once before handing him back to Ethan. "Tell Annie," he said, "that Lulu did not forget her either." Danielle looked at him, surprised first and then moved in a way she did not try to show too openly. "I will." She picked up her empty cup, then seemed to think better of it and set it back down. At the door, she turned once more. "You know," she said, "for a man who says he doesn't like dogs, you're doing a very convincing impression of someone being chosen by one." Ethan glanced down at Lulu, who had once again settled against his chest like a permanent conclusion. "I'm beginning to suspect," he said, "that my preferences are no longer the decisive factor." Danielle smiled. "No," she said. "That's usually how love starts." Then she opened the door and was gone. The apartment grew quiet again, but not the old kind. Lulu shifted in Ethan's arms and gave a contented little sigh. Ethan stood there for a moment in the morning light, holding the dog and staring at the closed door. He had spent most of his life believing that control was the same thing as safety. Now a 6-year-old girl, her exhausted mother, and a puppy named Lulu were gently proving otherwise. By late afternoon, the city had turned the color of brushed steel. A low bank of clouds had rolled in over Chicago, muting the skyline and flattening the light. But Riverside Park still held its usual quiet dignity. The trees along the walking path had thinned further since Annie first found Lulu in the grass. Leaves gathered in rustling piles near the benches. The lake beyond them looked gray and endless, its surface moving in calm, measured waves. Ethan Caldwell stood near the same bench where the whole impossible thing had begun. Lulu sat at his feet in a new harness, his red collar still visible beneath it, the little tag catching whatever light the afternoon offered. The veterinary appointment had gone better than Ethan expected. Lulu was underfed but healthy, young, strong, in need of routine, vaccines, and slightly less confidence. The veterinarian, a woman with kind eyes and no reverence whatsoever for billionaire schedules, had handed Ethan a packet of instructions thick enough to resemble legal counsel. Feed him 3 times a day. Watch for chewing. Do not leave electrical cords within reach. Puppies need stability. So do most people, Ethan had thought, though he had not said it aloud. Now he stood with one hand in his coat pocket and the other holding Lulu's leash, watching the entrance to the park with a patience that would have surprised everyone who worked for him. Lulu, less patient, kept shifting his weight from paw to paw. "You are going to make this look desperate," Ethan murmured. Lulu looked up at him, wagged once, and then fixed his gaze back on the path. A moment later, Annie appeared. She came through the gate at a near run, curls bouncing, coat half-buttoned, one hand in Danielle's, the other free and reaching forward before she was even close enough to touch anything. Her eyes found Lulu first, then Ethan, and then the entire small shape of her face changed. Not because she had been unhappy before, because relief is its own kind of sunlight. "Lulu," the puppy responded instantly, barking once in high, delighted surprise and pulling so hard on the leash that Ethan had to brace. Annie dropped Danielle's hand and raced the rest of the way. Ethan barely had time to lower the leash before Lulu launched himself forward in a clumsy burst of joy. Annie dropped to her knees on the grass just in time to catch him. He licked her chin, her nose, one cheek, and then circled helplessly in her lap as if unsure which part of her he needed to celebrate first. "Oh, Lulu," Annie whispered, laughing now. "I knew you'd remember me." Danielle came up beside them, more slowly, her work bag over one shoulder. A tiredness still tucked beneath her smile but no longer wearing the whole expression. "Looks like he did," she said. Ethan handed her the folded veterinary papers. "He's healthy," he said. "A little underweight but otherwise fine. Vaccinations started. More in 3 weeks." Danielle took the packet and looked at the thickness of it. "You got paperwork after all. I was told adoption usually involves it." She smiled faintly. "And how did he behave?" Ethan glanced down at Lulu, who was now trying to climb into Annie's coat as though attempting to become part of her wardrobe. With more optimism than discipline. "That sounds right." Annie looked up from the grass. "Did he cry?" "No." "Did he eat breakfast?" "Yes." "Did he sleep in your room?" Danielle closed her eyes briefly. "Annie," Ethan answered anyway. "Yes." Annie's grin widened. "I knew it. That should not sound like a victory." "It kind of is." Lulu barked softly, as if agreeing. For a little while, they simply stayed there. Annie on the grass with Lulu, Danielle standing beside her. Ethan near the bench, watching, saying only what was needed. Around them, the park moved at its own ordinary pace. A runner passed with her dog. An elderly couple shared a paper cup of coffee beneath one of the trees. Somewhere farther down the path, a saxophone player practiced scales that drifted in and out of the wind. Ordinary life, Ethan thought, was more moving than people gave it credit for. Annie finally stood, Lulu in her arms, and looked at Ethan with the solemnity she reserved for serious questions. "Did he like your house?" Ethan considered this. "I think he found it underdecorated." Annie nodded gravely. "Because it's too quiet." "Yes." She looked around the park, then back at him. "Was it better when he was there?" The question was so direct that Danielle glanced at Ethan, perhaps ready to soften it if necessary. He did not need softening. "Yes," he said. Annie seemed satisfied by the honesty of that. "I thought so." Danielle took a slow breath and looked out toward the lake. "She asked about him all day," she said quietly. According to her teacher, Lulu was discussed during reading, math, and one unauthorized moment during art. "That sounds academically disruptive," Ethan said. "It sounds like Annie," Danielle replied. Lulu wriggled to get down, and Annie set him gently on the ground. The puppy made a quick, determined circuit around all three of them, before settling between Annie and Ethan, as though he had drawn his own conclusion. Danielle noticed it too. "Well," she said, "I guess he's made his choice." Ethan looked down at the red collar, then at Annie, then at Danielle. For several days now, he had been postponing the shape of this moment by calling everything temporary. Trial period, evaluation, arrangement, practical language for emotional events. It had worked well enough in business. It did not work here. Annie watched him the way children watch adults when they are waiting for truth, not comfort. "Is Lulu yours now?" she asked. The wind moved through the trees. A few leaves skated across the path. Somewhere behind them, a child called for a parent near the swings. Ethan knelt so that he was closer to Annie's height. He looked at Lulu first, then at Annie. Then he answered carefully. "I think Lulu lives with me," he said, "but I don't think that means he belongs only to me." Annie blinked. "It doesn't." "No." He glanced up once at Danielle, and when she did not object, he continued. "I think some things come into our lives and make a bridge instead of a border." Annie was quiet, turning that over in her mind. Danielle looked at him differently then, not with surprise. Exactly, but with the quiet recognition that someone had just spoken from somewhere deeper than habit. Annie lowered her eyes to Lulu. "So he can still be my dog too?" Ethan smiled, Just slightly. He can still be your Lulu. That was enough. Relief, joy, and ownership all returned to Annie's face at once. She bent down and hugged Lulu so tightly the puppy let out a tiny puff of air and licked her ear in retaliation. Danielle laughed softly. You realize, she said to Ethan, that you've made yourself part of her routine now. Ethan stood again. I suspected as much. She doesn't let go of people easily. I'm beginning to think that may be one of her better qualities. Danielle looked at him for a long moment. The gray light from the lake caught in her eyes, softening the edges of her tiredness. Maybe, she said. That's why some people get found. He did not answer immediately. For years, Ethan had believed his life was a finished structure, successful, efficient, complete in all the ways that counted publicly. But standing there in Riverside Park, with a puppy circling his shoes and a child smiling up at him as if his presence had already been written into tomorrow, he understood something he should have known sooner. A life can look complete and still be waiting for its first real door to open. Annie stepped toward him and slipped one small hand into his free one without asking permission. Will you still bring him here? She asked. Yes. Even when it's cold? Yes. Even when you're busy? He looked at her. Busy had always been the word he used when he meant distant, protected, unavailable to disruption. But Lulu had disrupted him. Annie had seen through him. Danielle had spoken to him as if wealth did not exempt him from being human. Somewhere in the middle of all that, the old excuses had begun to sound thin. Yes, he said again. Even then, Annie nodded once, accepting the answer as something solid. Together, the four of them began walking slowly along the park path. Danielle with her tired grace, Annie with Lulu trotting between her and Ethan adjusting his pace without thinking so the little group held together naturally. The bench where Annie had first stopped him remained behind them, empty now except for a scattering of leaves. It did not look lonely anymore. Not because someone sat there, because what began there had moved forward. At the far end of the path, the clouds opened just enough for one band of late sunlight to slip through. It touched the lake, the trees, the red collar at Lulu's throat, Annie's upturned face, Danielle's quiet smile, and finally, Ethan himself. Annie looked up at him. Do you still hate dogs? Ethan glanced down at Lulu, who chose that moment to step directly onto his shoe and sit there as if claiming permanent rights. No, Ethan said. And this time the answer came easily. I think one of them saved me. Annie smiled as if she had known that all along, and with the lake moving beside them and the city rising behind them, they kept walking, not like strangers joined by coincidence, but like people beginning, carefully and unexpectedly, to belong in the same story. The story of Annie, Ethan, and Lulu reminds us that kindness often begins with small, unexpected moments. A lonely billionaire believed his life was complete. Yet a child's simple honesty and a stray puppy revealed the quiet emptiness he had learned to ignore. Annie showed that compassion does not depend on wealth, age, or power. It depends on the courage to care. When we choose empathy over distance, we create connections that change lives, including our own. In the end, the story teaches that belonging is not about ownership or control, but about showing up for one another, even in the smallest ways. Sometimes the people or even the animals we try to help are the ones who help us find our way back to what truly matters. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.